Good morning. Welcome to the National Press Club, the world's leading organization for journalists. My name is Michael Friedman, and I am the 113th president of the National Press Club. I'm the former general manager of CBS Radio Network, now journalist in residence at University of Maryland Global Campus, and executive producer of the public broadcasting series, The Kalb Report with Marvin Kalb. Our program this morning is about people of history, it's about historians, and it's about a unique American who has found inspiration in both. In a culminating moment of the great John Ford Western, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, a local newspaper editor tears up his notes after hearing for the first time the true story about a legendary gunfight many years after the fact. When asked why he destroyed his copy, the editor says, "Sir, this is the West. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend." Some of our history is based on legend. And as we evolve as a people and as a nation, we are revisiting some of those legends, correcting the record, and engaging in some very serious, thoughtful, and thought-provoking conversations. For truth, we rely on our best scholars, our best historians, the biographers of people of history. This morning, we meet a man who has, in quite significant ways, devoted serious time and attention to studying our nation's history, appreciating our history, and preserving it through his philanthropy. We will talk about his book, The American Story, as well as his own extraordinary American story. David Rubenstein is co-founder and co-executive chairman of the global private investment firm, the Carlyle Group, as well as chairman of the board of trustees of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, the Smithsonian Institution, and the Council on Foreign Relations, among his many affiliations. Born in Baltimore, Maryland, Mr. Rubenstein is a graduate of Duke University and the University of Chicago Law School. Quite relevant to today's discussion, in 2007, he acquired the last privately owned copy of the Magna Carta, which was then loaned to the National Archives. He bought it in part to ensure that it remained in America. He has also acquired and loaned for public display rare copies of the Declaration of Independence, the Emancipation Proclamation, the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Bay Psalm book, the first book published in British North America in 1640. He has donated tens of millions of dollars to repair the Washington Monument, repair and restore the Lincoln Memorial, and upgrade the Jefferson Memorial. In short, he is a person who cares deeply enough about his country, its history, and its future to pay it forward through what he calls patriotic philanthropy. David, welcome to the National Press
Club. My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Why don't we begin there? Talk to us for a moment about patriotic philanthropy.
Well, all philanthropy is patriotic in some sense. Philanthropy is a derivative of an ancient Greek word that means loving humanity. It doesn't mean rich people writing checks. And so I'd like to remind people that you can be philanthropic by giving your time, your energy, your ideas. The most valuable thing you can give is your time. You can always get more money if you're disposed to do so. You can't get more time. And so I try to remind people that these lists of great philanthropists that we list often list how much money they've given away, but they don't actually list people who've given great ideas or time and so forth. That's unfortunate. Philanthropy is something that the United States is very much the leader in the world in. We give a larger percentage of our GDP to philanthropic causes than any other country, and there's a lot of historic reasons for that. By patriotic philanthropy, I didn't mean to say that other philanthropy is not patriotic, but I was trying to coin a phrase that basically described what I was trying to do, which was to remind people of the history and heritage of our country. So with the documents or fixing monuments or memorials, I was trying to remind people of the history and heritage. Now, why is that? What's the relevance of it? This is it. Our human brain has not yet evolved so much that if you go to a computer slide and you see the Magna Carta, it will have the same effect as if you go and actually see the Magna Carta. Because When you see it on a computer slide, you'll probably go to the next computer slide or just be a quick blip in your brain. But if you actually take the time to go visit the Magna Carta or some other similar historic artifact, you're going to probably spend time reading about it before you go, or when you're there, or afterwards. And so therefore it has more of an impact. Now, why do I care whether people learn more about the Magna Carta or other historic documents or the Washington Monument? This is the main reason. This is the whole purpose of it. The theory of history is that you study what went on in the past so that you can correct the mistakes you made in the past and improve on the good things, and basically civilization will advance. Sadly, right now, we've been obsessed with STEM and other things, and the result is we don't teach history very much. Only 2% of males going to college today major in history. Only 1% of females major in history. History majors are down dramatically at every major college. You can graduate from any college in the United States today without having taken an American history course. So why is this important? Well, the results are in certain surveys. You see this. 3/4 of Americans today, 75%, cannot name the 3 branches of government. 1/3 of Americans cannot even name 1 branch of government. 10% of American college graduates think that Judge Judy is on the United States Supreme Court, which is not yet the case. And 16% of Americans in another survey said that Justice Scalia is the Chief Justice of the United States. He's not even alive anymore. And one last fact before I end my soliloquy on this point. If you are a naturalized citizen, are there any naturalized citizens in this room? Okay. To be a naturalized citizen, it used to be you had to take 14 years of residence. Now it's 5 years. After 5 years of residence, you have to study for a citizenship test. Ultimately, you take 10 questions, and you have to pass 6 of them. Of those people who take it, 91% pass, presumably with some studying. The questions are not that difficult. Who's the first president of the United States? How many branches of government are there? Things like that. The same survey was recently given to 41,000 native-born Americans. And you can predict where this is going. In 49 out of 50 states, a majority of people who are born in this country couldn't pass the basic citizenship test that foreign applicants to our country have to pass. Only one state, Vermont, could a majority of citizens and barely pass it.
Your book, The American Story, Conversations with Master Historians, comprises a series of quite remarkable interviews that you conducted at the Library of Congress with scholars, historians, journalists, before members of Congress in a neutral and nonpartisan setting. Talk about the genesis of this project.
The theory of history, as I said, is that you want to know the past so you can improve upon it or avoid the mistakes. Who better to know the past than the people making the laws? So my theory was, why not spend some time educating members of Congress, not that they're not perfectly educated already, but maybe they can learn a little bit more about history. And so what I would do is I would host a dinner with the Library of Congress once a month at the Library of Congress, where members can come. They can come through underground tunnels, so it's very easy for them to come from their office buildings. And we get 250 to 350 people coming each time. About half of them are members, half are their guests. And the members have great interest in it. I ask them to sit with people from the opposite party and the opposite house, which they rarely can do in a public setting anymore. And they have a kind of a reception before where they talk about whatever they want to talk about, but then they see the historic documents relating to the book that the author will talk about. Then we go down, we have a dinner, and after dinner I will do about a 45-minute interview, and then the members can ask questions. Other questions tend to be statements, not questions. But and then they're like other people. They bring their dog-eared copies of their books just like anybody else. They want them autographed. And so what I did is take about 16 of those interviews. I've now done about 50 of them, and I put them into this one book, and I summarized them a bit in advance, and then I kind of gave the edited transcript in a way that I think people can read each interview on its own and learn a lot about history without having to read a detailed book. Now, let me just say, if you are disposed to do so, reading a detailed book or a textbook would probably learn more, but I don't know how many people will read a 900-page textbook. And so on the theory that not that many people will do it, if people read this book, they'll learn a little bit more about history than they did without the tribulations of having to go through a 900-page textbook.
There are the interviews, and then there are your introductions to the interviews, which are quite interesting and intriguing. Talk about your process for writing those introductions.
Well, I did the interviews, and then when I decided to do the book, I would go back and reread the interview and just think about what I could say that would encapsulate what the person said. You want to say enough so that people have a kind of a appetizer of what the interview is going to be. You don't want to say what's in the entire interview because people might not read the interview. And you always want to have a little fact or kernel that might be interesting and might be a tease a bit to read the entire interview.
The late Washington Post publisher Phil Graham famously coined the phrase, "Journalism is the first rough draft of history." In fact, in 1776, many Americans first saw the Declaration of Independence in a newspaper. What's your impression of the value of newspapers in both writing the first draft of history and preserving it for future generations?
Well, I may not be the best person to be objective on that because I am obsessed with still reading newspapers, and I realize that I am increasingly a minority. So I read 7 newspapers a day, but not online. I go buy them, and I've already read my newspapers for today, and I like reading them, I like turning the pages, I like doing that. But obviously, many people who are younger than me feel that newspapers are a bit dinosaurs. I can't get my 3 children, all of whom are extremely well educated, to really read physical newspapers. They read something online, and they're like their generation. Newspapers, though, give you a more or less instant report on what happened that day or the previous day, and I think they have very good analyses at time to time. But because we have demonized journalism to some extent, we find increasingly that people think that everything is biased, and therefore people are afraid of reading anything, and they just therefore diminish the importance of newspapers relative to what they were when I was growing up.
In the course of your interviews, did you find that there were differences in the way the journalists you talked with approached their subjects versus the historians and those you consider scholars?
Well, sure. A journalist like Bob Woodward is different than, when he writes a book, he's writing a different type of book than Doris Kearns Goodwin or David McCullough. Some of the scholars who write these books, like Doris Kearns Goodwin, spend 10 years researching and writing. So you really have to be dedicated to that process. A journalist like Bob Woodward, as good as he is, he will probably spend about 1.5 years doing the research, and then he writes the book. And maybe the whole process takes 2 years, not to diminish it, but it's different than the kind of sitting in the library kind of thing that some of these scholars do, where they're just poring over old letters or manuscripts for years at a time. They're both very valuable services, and I think Bob Woodward's books have had a record. I think he has had more #1 bestsellers in the nonfiction category than anybody in our history. I think he's written like 20-some books, and I think about 19 or so were #1 bestsellers. It's an extraordinary record. But I think his book is a different type of read than Doris Kearns Goodwin book or David Blight's book. I just interviewed at the Library of Congress a couple of days ago, David Blight on his book on Frederick Douglass, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2019. He's a Yale professor. It's an incredibly scholarly work, but it takes a while to get through it. It's like 800 pages. And sometimes I think historians now are getting paid by the word because they are longer and longer. Charles Dickens used to get paid by the word, and sometimes these books they're exhaustive. I interviewed, and it's a great book, and I'll interview again Jill Lepore on her book on American history, These Truths. But these books are often 900 pages, and it takes a while to get through them. I don't know if everybody has the patience anymore to go through these books, but maybe they do.
Your interview with Walter Isaacson was quite intriguing. Most reporters subscribe to shoe leather journalism. They like to actually interview people. Talk about what you learned about the difference between writing about someone who's still alive and someone who's dead.
For those who don't know, Walter Isaacson is himself a Renaissance man in my view. From New Orleans, went to Harvard, Rhodes Scholar, ultimately became the top editor at Time magazine, the president for a while of CNN, for maybe more than a dozen years, ran the Aspen Institute. He's now teaching at Tulane. But while he did all those things, he wrote biographies on Steve Jobs, Benjamin Franklin, Albert Einstein, and on the wise men he did with Evan Thomas. And he's kind of a person who can be a journalist because he was a journalist, but he also can write fairly scholarly works. And think about it. to write a book, and he did a book on Leonardo da Vinci as well. To do a book on Albert Einstein, you have to go back and actually learn German, and you have to know physics and understand the theories of relativity, which he did. It's quite impressive that he could do that. Walter writes books that are, I'd say, popular books, pretty scholarly, but they're not as scholarly as, let's say, the most scholarly person at Harvard or Yale or Berkeley or Stanford might be, but they're readable. And if you write a great book, there is a scholar, I won't mention his name, who writes incredibly scholarly books on a very famous president, but nobody reads them because they're too dense, they're too long. So you need to have people read your books, and so one of the things that Walter Isaacson has been able to do is to figure out how to write in a journalistic way, fairly scholarly, but also have great access to things. For example, his book on Steve Jobs, I think has sold, 12 million copies or something. It's extraordinary. People were so interested in Steve Jobs. It's not a scholarly book in a traditional sense, but it's a book that people learned a lot about what Steve Jobs in the industry was about, in the computer industry. So I think it's a great public service.
When you look at some of the best obituaries in the New York Times and the Washington Post and a few other publications, which are sometimes written as what are called appreciations, they're really very dynamic and wonderful feature stories. It's just that the subject isn't available to you for the interview. And Walter talked about, in your time with him, the difference between writing about Ben Franklin and, for instance, Steve Jobs. You asked him what was the impetus for the Steve Jobs book, and he said, Steve Jobs called me and told me to write a book about him.
Well, there are three types of books you can do. You can write about books that people have been long dead, Benjamin Franklin. And the advantage of that is they can't come back from the grave and say you're wrong. Then you can write about people who are probably not going to live too long and won't see the book, which is Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs knew that he was dying. He asked Walter Isaacson to write a book about him. He'd earlier asked him to do so, but Walter said, well, I'd like to write about people who are dead and so forth. Ultimately, he had access to the family, and the book came out just about 2 or 3 weeks after Steve Jobs died. There, too, you have a situation where you have access to the person. You can talk to him or her, but they are not going to be around to rebut what you wrote. And then third, you have people who are still alive. When one of the books that I didn't mention earlier that Walter Isaacson wrote was about Henry Kissinger. And Kissinger didn't like the book, and I think it didn't talk for a while because Kissinger didn't like what was said about him. So there's an advantage of writing about a book about somebody who's long dead. There's no relatives around to be upset with what you say. But on the other hand, you don't have the immediacy of it. And I often ask authors, when they're writing about somebody who's dead for 100 years, if you had dinner with this person, what would you like to ask them? And many people say, well, I'd love to ask these questions or that question. But actually, in many cases, they'd say, well, I think I know everything about the person, and I don't have an obsession with having dinner with this person because I've spent so much time living with the person, I feel I know what he or she would say.
Marvin Kalb and his brother Bernard wrote a biography together of Henry Kissinger, and as the story goes, somebody asked Kissinger what he thought of the book, and he said, I don't know about the book. It was called Kissinger, and he said, I don't know about the book, but I love the title.
Well, Kissinger has a lot of more books written about him, and usually when they're written, he doesn't like what is written initially, but then later he comes around to it, and he's a unique figure in American history, for sure.
Based on your interviews, did you get a sense that people make their times or that times make the people?
The great debate of historians have had for several thousand years is it great men or great women that actually make something happen, or the events that are coming along, and so great men or great women kind of ride the wave? Nobody really knows the answer. I think there's probably something in between, but clearly if certain people hadn't existed, certain events probably wouldn't have happened. So there are great people who can make things happen, but if Martin Luther King had not lived, I suspect at some point there would have been a civil rights revolution. He might not have been the progenitor of it, or one of the progenitors of it, but there would have been others. I suspect if Abraham Lincoln hadn't come along, eventually we would have ended slavery, maybe not quite the way he did it, but so I think people can make big changes, and they can make events happen. If Hitler hadn't come along, I suspect Germany would never have done what it did, but Germany might have still gone into a world war. It might have been different than what would happen. We wouldn't have had the Holocaust, almost certainly. So I think great men and great women, or terrible men and terrible women, can make a difference, but I think sometimes events will eventually produce a certain effect that would be similar to what a great man or woman would have done.
Through these interviews that you've conducted, have you felt that you can actually touch the people of history through their biographers?
It is interesting how you can read a biography of somebody that's dead for 100 years or 200 years, and when it's so much detail, you feel like you know these people. And so after you read Doris Kearns Goodwin's book about Abraham Lincoln, Team of Rivals, you feel like you know Lincoln and his cabinet rivals. And so these are great gifts to knowledge that these books can be written. So yes, I think you do.
There's one very different interview in the book, and it is with Chief Justice John Roberts.
Right.
Talk about your motivation for interviewing the Chief Justice. I understand that the turnout among members of Congress was the largest of any of the interviews you conducted.
Right. John Roberts, I've been, for a number of years, I've been the chairman of the Smithsonian, and the Chief Justice is the chancellor of the Smithsonian, so you get to spend some time with him. Quarterly we have lunch and so forth. So I've gotten to know him over the years, and he's a very, very smart guy. Harvard College, summa cum laude in 3 years, Harvard Law School, magna cum laude, Supreme Court clerk. Actually, he points out, and I think we have it in the book, in the interview, that as a young man, he was invited to work at the White House as an associate deputy counsel for Ronald Reagan. So the first day he gets there, he gets a call from a friend of his who works at the White House saying, the president is going to call you shortly this morning to welcome you. The president likes to welcome, President Reagan likes to welcome everybody who comes to the White House. So you'll be getting one today. John Roberts, who's a young kid, he didn't think he was going to see the president or hear from the president. He's all happy. So sure enough, 10 minutes later, a call comes in, please hold for the president. All right, so John Roberts is sitting there holding for the president. Then 5 minutes later, the president's not on. 10 minutes later, the president's not on. Then he figures 15 minutes later, the president's not on. Maybe Gorbachev is called. Maybe there's a nuclear war going on. You don't know. 30 minutes later, 45 minutes later, about 45 minutes into holding for the president, he hears laughter in the hallway. There was a bet on how long this smart guy would take before he realized the president's not calling you on your first day. But I asked John Roberts at the beginning, I said, Mr. Chief Justice, at the beginning, and I thought the reason I wanted to put John Roberts in there is that the Supreme Court is only a couple hundred yards from the Capitol, and actually the Supreme Court used to be in the Capitol building until the Supreme Court building opened around 1935 or so. I wanted members of Congress to understand better how the court works because although their offices are not that far apart, they don't really have that much interaction. So when I began the interview, I said, Mr. Chief Justice, did you always want to be, as a little boy, Chief Justice of the United States? And he said, well, no, I didn't. As a little boy, I didn't. What did you want to be? An Associate Justice, if not the Chief Justice? No. What did you want to be? A judge of any type? No. Did you want to be a lawyer? No, I didn't want that either. Well, what did you want to be? I wanted to be a historian. All I cared about was American history. My father said, John, there's no money in being a historian. You won't be able to make a living. You won't be able to support your family, and nobody will read the books you write. John said, I don't care. This is what I care about. So he went off to Harvard and he majored in history. He came back from spring break, gets off at the airport in Boston, Logan Airport, and gets in a cab and says to the cab driver, please take me to Cambridge. And the cab driver said, are you a student at Harvard? Yes, I am. What are you majoring in? Majoring in history. Well, the cab driver said, when I was a student at Harvard, that's what I majored in also. So John Roberts went to law school and history changed.
Wonderful story. Let's talk about truth. Is there a difference between revisionist history and filling in the blanks along the way as we learn more information about people and events?
Well, of course, we look at things differently than we did maybe 100 years ago, so there's always some revisionist history. So, for example, when all of us were in school, or most of us, or if you're roughly my age, we looked up to George Washington, first President of the United States, presided over the Constitutional Convention, won the Revolutionary War, an extraordinary person. It wasn't emphasized to me when I was in the 6th grade or 7th grade or 8th grade that he was a gigantic slave owner. He owned roughly 300 slaves. Upon his death, he and his wife had roughly 300 slaves. So when I was growing up, Thomas Jefferson was the writer of the Declaration of Independence, and an extraordinary document that it was a little bit of plagiarism, but plagiarism was thought to be okay in those days, so it wasn't a terrible thing. But it wasn't emphasized to people in my day, when I was a kid, that he had a relationship with his slave, Sally Hemings, for 30 years. And was it consensual? Was it forced? You never know. We will probably never know that answer to that. But now people look at him differently because he had this relationship. And he was a slave owner as well, and he had roughly 200 slaves at Monticello. So yes, there has been revisionism. These people who we once idolized in certain ways, we realized they were humans with flaws in those particular cases, as were, I think, 9 of the first 12 presidents were slave owners. So we look at things much differently than we did years ago, and I think some of that is correct. On the other hand, sometimes you can go back and have modern views, and maybe it's unfair to criticize people for things that they did 200 or 300 or 400 years ago, which were acceptable then and not now. But there's no doubt revisionism. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not good.
For our viewers and listeners, we're speaking with David Rubenstein about his book, The American Story, Conversations with Master Historians. Going back to that quote from the man who shot Liberty Valance, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. You actually have a story about taking your then 8-year-old son to Mount Vernon, right, which helped propel a myth.
Right. So what it was this. You've all heard the story that George Washington cut down a cherry tree when he was a little boy. His father asked him if he cut it down, and he said, "I cannot tell a lie. I did." Now, that story was completely wrong. It never happened. It was made up by an early biographer of George Washington, and there is nobody who's a serious historian would say that that story is true. But okay, but people still believe it. I believed it when I was little, and my son probably believed it. So when I went to Mount Vernon, took my 8-year-old son, we're in the back area of Mount Vernon, and there was a big, not a tree, kind of twig or maybe a branch that had fallen off, and my son said, "Dad, is that the cherry tree that George Washington cut?" And I said, "I cannot tell a lie, it is." So, maybe it was, who knows? But he believed it, and, it's like Santa Claus. I mean, is it bad to tell people that there's no Santa Claus when they're 3 or 4 years old? I don't know. But maybe they'll figure it out eventually. So I didn't want to disturb his view about George Washington, so I told him a little lie.
When the legend becomes fact, print the legend. I'm going to ask our wonderful audience here at the National Press Club to prepare for asking your questions, and we're going to come to you in just a moment. Lindsay Underwood of our team at the Press Club has a microphone which she will bring to you. I'm going to ask David one more question, so get ready. What that is current would you think is most worth preserving? Sometimes, for instance, we know immediately when we make history, and I will suggest the election of Barack Obama as president, for instance. Perhaps for those of us that are baseball fans, even the Washington Nationals winning the World Series. How do we ensure that these don't become fleeting moments in a McWorld that consumes information quickly and disposes of it like fast food?
Right. Well, with an information overload that people have today, it's very easy to kind of just, watch some Twitter feeds and think you understand what's going on. Most young people today seem to be getting their news from Facebook Live or some Facebook presentation or from Twitter and so forth. It is amazing how many people think that this is all they need to know. But newspaper sales are way down, as you know. Newspapers aren't selling the way they used to and so forth. I think that one of the best things I encourage people to do in this regard is to read books. Now, reading is a sad situation in our country. We are the wealthiest country in the world, in many ways the most educated in the world, but roughly 14% of our population, our adult population, is functionally illiterate, which means they can't read past the 4th grade level. And I don't mean somebody that came from Latin America and can read Spanish but can't read English. I mean somebody that came from Latin America can't read Spanish either. 14% of our adults are functionally illiterate. And if you're functionally illiterate, you have no chance, in my view, of escaping from the bottom of our economic system. 2/3 of the people in our federal prison system are functionally illiterate. 80% of the people in our juvenile delinquency system are functionally illiterate. And so there's another problem called illiteracy, where people don't read books when they can. 30% of college graduates never read another book after they graduate from college. 50% of Americans have not bought a book or been in a bookstore in the last 5 years. 50% of Americans have not bought a book or been in a bookstore in the last 5 years. So I tell younger people that the best thing to do is to exercise your brain. And when I give a commencement speech, I say, great, you've got your degree, but you're not an educated person. You're beginning the process of being educated, and you want to keep your muscle, which is your brain, alive. You've got to keep reading. Now, you can read lots of different things, but nothing exercises the brain so much as reading a book. Now, other things exercise the brain, but in terms of reading a book, because you have to concentrate for a while. It's not like reading a newspaper article where you can read it in 30 seconds, 60 seconds and go on to the next thing. If you read books, you tend to really focus things more. And I think people that read books generally tend to have better thought processes. They can think better, and I think it makes them more educated. And in Washington, D.C., we have the National Book Festival, which is on around Labor Day usually. About 200,000 people come, and it's incredible to see 150 of the best authors in the United States coming, reading from their books, signing their books, being interviewed about it, and it's free. And I love people who go to that. I've been involved in it for a while, and to me, books are very important. When I was very young, my parents couldn't afford to buy a lot of books, so I would go to the library and I would take out as many books as I could. Take out 12. You're allowed to take out 12 at your age of 6. And I would read them all in one day, and I had to wait another week before I could take them out, another 12. But I love reading books, and to me it's something more and more people should consider doing as part of their life, is reading books.
Thank you. Not only perhaps is reading books a challenge today, but sometimes when we ask questions of our audience, or when our audience asks questions here at the National Press Club, they come in on cards for the moderator to read, and I can assure you that penmanship has gone down a long way as well.
Well, I have that problem too, and I've always been trying to figure out why my handwriting is so bad, and it's a phenomenon that I've observed recently. Although we do more and more computer and more things are typed and digital, as a way to avoid being completely digital and to be more personal, I seem to be getting more and more handwritten notes, more and more. I get them all the time. And I feel it's bad to keep saying to people, my handwriting requires a degree in hieroglyphics to understand it, so I'm going to give you a typed note back. So I'm trying to learn how to redo my handwriting, which is not that good. And my theory about it was this, that your handwriting is taught largely in the 2nd grade. And I think that what happened was I was out for the Jewish holidays, and that's when they taught people how to write. Because when I came back, my classmates were writing so well, and I never could catch up. So I just wish I hadn't taken off those time for the Jewish holidays. That's why my handwriting was so bad. So I'm still working on trying to get it better.
Well, no hieroglyphics today. We're ready for your questions. Lindsay, there you are.
My name is Carl Henn, and I wondered if you could tell us what about your life experience drew you to your interest in history?
My life experience?
What about your life experience drew you to your interest in history? You've just referenced the fact that you came from humble beginnings.
Right.
And I came from a very large family of 9 kids, and we also took out a lot of books from the library, so I can definitely relate to that.
So the question is, to what do you attribute your great interest in history?
Okay. I wasn't good in sciences, so if I had been great in physics or chemistry, maybe I would have spent more time in that. But I guess it was that when I was in the 6th grade, John Kennedy gave his famous inaugural address. My teacher went through it with us word for word, and I was inspired to go into public service because of it. And I just began reading more about him, and then more reading about public figures. And I guess I liked history, and so I went to law school, and then when I went into professional life, I worked on Capitol Hill for a while, and I worked in the White House for 4 years. And when you work in the White House, it's a historic place, so maybe that was part of it. And the head of the White House Historic Association is here, Stuart. He's done a great job there, and I think I enjoyed my time at the White House, and maybe by living in Washington, I feel a sense of history. So maybe it's that I was better a student in that area. Maybe it was that I worked here in Washington for a while. I just think history is something that we should learn more about. Now, I'm not against STEM education, but I do think that you should remember that many people who run major corporations are not STEM majors. They actually tend to be social science, humanities, and history majors, among other things. But people seem to forget that, and there is an obsession with getting a first job out of college. And if you're not a STEM major, people think you're not going to get a job, which is not the case. When I hire people, I could care less what they major about. I've interviewed and hired thousands of people over the years, and I never care what I don't even look at what they major in. It doesn't make a difference to me. It's just whether they can talk, they can think, they can express themselves, and those skills often come not from STEM, but often come from the social sciences.
Thank you. I'll let Lindsay direct the traffic here. There we go.
David, first of all, nice seeing you again. Your book is fabulous. Highly recommend it to everybody. One of the things that fascinates me about you is you do so many things. You've said today you read 7 newspapers every day. You read books.
Right.
You're running a huge company. You're the chairman of the Smithsonian Kennedy Center, and these are just a few of the things. So how do you get so much done, and what are some of the secrets you can share with us so we can be more effective in our busy lives?
My parents never told people, but there were triplets when I was born. So one of me does the business, one does the philanthropy, and one does the other stuff. No, I don't play golf, and that saves about 50 hours a week because so that's the thing. Look. I love what I'm doing, and I'm now at the point of life I don't have to do anything I don't want to do. So I'm only doing things I love. When you love doing something, it's not work. So it's not a challenge to me to do that. And my biggest problem is I have now reached an age which I didn't think I would reach, 70. Now, 70 used to be old. When I was in the White House, I said, "Dear God, please let us run against Ronald Reagan. He's 69 years old. Nobody that old can get out of bed in the morning." Turns out that 69 is like the youngest person who's going to be president of the United States in a long time. The people running for president today are, the likely ones are 70, 77, 78, 78. I mean, it's amazing how 69 or 70 is nothing, but I am now 70. And so what I'm trying to do now is race to the finish line. So I don't know how much longer. You never know when your brain is going to give out or some part of your body. Think about your body. You've had this body your whole life, and at some point, some part of the body will say, "I'm checking out of here and I'm going to do something bad." You don't know what's going to happen. So you just got to keep going on. So I am propelled forward by the idea that I'm racing against the clock because at some point something will fall apart and I won't be able to do what I want to do. So the truth is I don't do a lot of things that some other people that consume a lot of time. I don't play golf. I don't go to bars and so forth. I don't drink alcohol, so maybe that's a help plus. But there are many people doing more important things than me and done them better. I've done okay, but I could have done a lot better in other things. I got lucky in life too.
Okay, we have another question on this side.
Good morning, David.
Yes.
When you mentioned the statistics with the Federal Bureau of Prisons and the juvenile delinquency, I'm an interdisciplinary artist from the District of Columbia. I was given a life sentence at the age of 16 for something that I didn't do. I served 22 years in prison. One of the things that helped carry me to transcend that adversity was that I read the Wall Street Journal every day. I read all of the books you mentioned, the Team of Rivals, Walter Isaacson book about Steve Jobs. So with you being an investor and someone who is passionate about the arts and philanthropy, what are you doing to make sure that these statistics of 80% of people in the Federal Bureau of Prisons and the juvenile delinquents have this opportunity to develop? Because for someone like me, I had a mother who worked at the Library of Congress who could afford to give me books from Amazon and subscribe to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. But most people in prison come from intergenerational poverty and illiteracy. So as an investor and a philanthropist, what are you doing to make sure that we turn down those numbers that we have with millions of people who find themselves in the prison industrial complex? Thank you.
Well, I wish I was doing more. I wish I could solve all those problems. And if I had the ability to do it and had the answers for how to solve the problem, I'd be in Iowa or South Carolina or somewhere, but I'm not. I'd say I am a large donor to philanthropic causes, and I created the literacy causes. I should say I'm a large donor to to literacy causes, and I've created the Literacy Awards at the Library of Congress, and I underwrite the National Book Festival, which is designed to get more people to read. But in terms of prisons, that has not been one of my main areas of focus. It is an important point that you make, and there are some of the projects that I have supported at the Library of Congress which do provide funding, but there's not enough funding for that. And you make a very good point. Your people who are in prison, many of them cannot read. Those that can read may not have access to books. It's a real challenge, and what you've accomplished by what you just described is quite amazing. So I assume your mother was very supportive of you while you were in there, and so you've been out for how long?
11 months.
11 months. And what are you doing now?
I self-published 11 books while I was on the inside covering multiple genres. So since I've been out through the books that I published, I've been able to get a fellowship at the House Young Arts Lab and Echoing Green, the Social Justice Fellowship. So I pretty much just been living off of my visual artwork, my spoken word performances, and doing speaking engagement at criminal justice panels throughout the country.
I would highly recommend that you write a book about your own experience, because it sounds fairly unusual to have that kind of experience in terms of the reading and the importance in getting out and so forth after serving as long as you did. So I would highly recommend you talk to a lawyer who can help you get a person who will publish your book. It'd be quite interesting.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for your words. So my question is about, you've mentioned about social media. You've mentioned about information overload. Today, a lot of education that people receive are from media. So I kind of see it as a way, as an avenue of education. So my question is, how do you think we can use, I've watched all your interviews on Bloomberg, so how do you think we can promote or reshape today's education through media?
Race-based education through media. How do you promote that?
Promote?
Race-based education. Is that right?
I'm sorry.
Say again.
Promote?
How do you promote education through media?
Oh, I see.
Promote what?
Promote education through media.
Well, I don't know that I have the answer for that. You know, when I'm on television, I'm trying to educate people by interviewing them. That's a technique that I have developed, and I try to get people to watch these things and make them entertaining or interesting. But the most important thing that I think you can do in the early years is have parents, a parent, mother, or father, who help you learn how to read and place on you the importance of learning. And it's a sad situation, but many times you have parents who are not literate, and they obviously are not going to be able to help their kids read. Most children learn a large part about how to read from their parents. One of the programs that the Literacy Awards that I sponsored, supported, gave a prize to was an interesting program where you, if your parent is a foreign in the military and you can't be there to teach your child because you're overseas, they kind of televise the parent reading a book to the child who's back, let's say, in the United States. And that obviously is done to encourage people, young people, to learn to read, and their parents help them read. You know, having parents or a parent or a guardian help you get through the process is indispensable. For those people that don't have that advantage, it's a big problem. I don't have an answer what I would recommend doing, but I just think that learning more about the importance of getting a good education and reading is indispensable in life, in my view. And I think many parents place more value on teaching their kids how to learn and being good students than almost anything else. And you see that a lot in Asia, where parents in China, Korea, Japan, among other places, place enormous amounts of attention on their kids learning how to be good students.
Morning, David. So I am a math and computer science nerd. You're right that I graduated from MIT without having to take a single history course. In fact, reading history is like torture to me, and your book is my very first hard copy history book. So But in recent years, I actually read computer programs faster than I read books. In recent years, I have come across this group called Shenyun Performing Arts, and they put 5,000 years of Chinese history and culture on stage. And I went to see it. I was really fascinated by it, and I became so fascinated that I actually started reading history. So have you thought about putting some of your books in the same format and put them on stage, and because the arts is very powerful.
Putting my what? If I thought about putting my what? Lindsay, can you?
On stage.
About doing what?
Transferring your books.
Oh.
Okay.
Well,
Interesting.
Lin-Manuel Miranda hasn't called me yet, but, when you think about it, Lin-Manuel Miranda read this book on a vacation he had in Mexico, Hamilton's book by Ron Chernow, and he turned it into this famous play, of course, a musical, and that has done more to educate young people about American history in the Revolutionary War period than virtually any book we have, because people go there, and so many adults are now trying to subsidize other people to go who are children to make sure that they can actually see this period of time. It's not a perfect way to learn history, but it's better than not learning anything. I haven't really thought about what I can do more than what I'm doing. I'm trying now I'm putting a lot of money into civics education, history education, a whole variety of other projects, but I get about 10 of these proposals a day, and I don't know which one's actually going to work the most or best, so I kind of experiment with a number of different ones. But I'm working on it, and there are a number of good programs out there. What I'm trying to do now with this book is to get people excited about just reading, some things about our great figures in history. And then there's an audio version of this as well, where you can actually listen to the people talking. But I don't have a brilliant answer what to do with it.
There was some high praise in this young lady's comments, in which I believe she said that she graduated from MIT without once taking a history course, and that reading about this was torture, and yours was the first history book that she's read.
There was actually MIT has a pretty good history department. There was a terrific Revolutionary War scholar there, Pauline Mayer, who died recently, who wrote a great book about the Declaration of Independence. But it's not a required course at MIT. But what did you major in?
Math and computer science.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. Next up.
Hi, David. My name's Jamie Horwitz, and I was one of those history majors and a member of the Headliners Committee these days. But, and this is a dream project you have. I'm envious of it. But the question I have is that I've read a lot of these books, if not most of them. And as good as some of these historians are, with a lot of these books, there's moments in them where I feel like throwing the book against the wall, or where I say, where did you get that from? Or, you gotta be kidding me, with some of their conclusions. Like with Isaacson, like when he wrote the Steve Jobs book, toward the end, he takes Jobs verbatim, where he says, well, I couldn't build any of these computers in the United States because we don't graduate enough manufacturing engineers. And he didn't really challenge him on that. And I look at like Virginia Tech and $1 billion campus next to Amazon. I think that, if he was going to build a factory in the United States, there would be plenty of institutions that would have created engineering programs for manufacturing engineers. I'm just curious. I mean, you obviously read a lot of history. You know these historians. What bothers you in their books? Where have you challenged them, either in your interviews or backstage?
Challenged about?
Like, where did you get this fact from? Or how did you come to that conclusion? You must not fully accept everything in these books, do you?
Well, more complicated. Let me answer it this way. I'm trying to conduct a 45-minute interview, typically about an 800-page book. And so what I'm trying to do is to get somebody through the trajectory of their book without challenging them. If I had a 3-hour interview, or I was having dinner with them, I would probably do different things. But when you interview somebody and you're trying to get through the book, and you've got 300 members of Congress there who attention span on some of these things might not be extraordinary, you need to ask the question, get a reasonably good answer and go on to the next thing. Otherwise, you'll be bogged down. So I try not to get into debates with people about what they've concluded. Sometimes I find that some of the authors, I won't mention them, haven't read their book in 10 or 15 or 20 years. So they wrote it, so they think they know it, but then when you ask them about a book that they wrote 20 years ago, they've forgotten what they wrote. And since I've read it more recently, I know more than they do about what's in their book. I try very politely to try to, give an answer that's more correct sometimes than when they do, but not to kind of embarrass them. But I don't try to get into debates with them because the debates will go back and forth and it'll take away too much of their time. And I'm really trying to tease people into reading the whole book. And I give away, I buy a copy of everybody's books and then I give them to every member of Congress after the session. So that I'm giving them an appetizer. Hopefully they'll read the whole book. But and on your point, sure, lots of historians have conclusions that you say are probably not justified, and if you had a long time to talk with them, you might be able to challenge some of it. But they're just humans like anybody else. They come to conclusions. Sometimes they have biases. Sometimes they don't. Some people who are more liberal in their point of views will have different conclusions on the facts than people who are more conservative. But I generally don't try to get into that kind of debate with them in that 45-minute discussion.
David, we have about 10 minutes left, so we do have time for a few more questions. Let me pose one, and then we'll go back to our audience. Advances in animation and special effects and pyrotechnics have left some of those running some of our most venerable historic sites wondering if they need to juice up their attractions to remain viable. Can you offer some thoughts on that?
Well, I think the attendance at museums is going down around the country. The attendance at historic sites is going down around the country. So why is that? Well, there's so many other things that are competing for people's time and attention. People aren't as interested in history. So some people are trying to, let's say, jazz up the attraction by having more lifelike things or things that are more relevant. So at Monticello, they've rebuilt a lot of Monticello to make it more attractive to people. There's visitor centers there. There's much more education. There are walking tours with what you can listen to, listen on a video, on an audio about what you're seeing. I don't have any problems with that. I think as long as you're not, denigrating what they're seeing or you're trying to exaggerate what they're seeing. But clearly, you have to attract people, and if you can't attract people to show up, then having a great facility doesn't probably mean that much. So that doesn't bother me as long as they're not, lying about the history, and I don't know that anybody is doing that.
Okay, thank you. And we're coming back to our audience here.
Dr. Elaine Soreo, Associate Rector for UACU in Kiev, Ukraine. I really, really appreciated the presentations you just made, especially starting with the importance of everyone's engagement and supporting things. You don't have to be a philanthropic person monetarily, but you can do it by giving your support, your life, involvement, your time. I would like to ask you, what is the most surprising interview you've ever had? You mentioned your personal relationship and knowing Chief Justice Roberts, and you gave an anecdote about his life. But what have you were most surprised by, because you maybe didn't know the person that well, and something came out that it just absolutely floored you? And then second, who would you like to interview next who you had not ever interviewed, and they would be perfect? Thank you.
Queen Elizabeth doesn't do interviews, probably off the table, and I'm told the Pope doesn't do interviews. So they would be attractive people. I have interviewed, I think, all the living U.S. presidents, and I interviewed Donald Trump at one point before he was president. I told him he had no chance of being elected president when I told him he was going to run. But in any event, I've interviewed a lot of people now. I have a new book coming out in September with my interviews from Bloomberg. It's on leadership. And it's about interviews with David Petraeus, Colin Powell, Jim Baker, Oprah Winfrey, George Bush, Bill Clinton, and so forth. And they talk about what it means to be a leader and how people become leaders. And I think it's interesting to kind of see what it takes to be a leader and how people sometimes become leaders and sometimes don't. And I won't bore you with what's in that book right now, but my theory of it is, among other things, that leadership, that life is divided into three parts. And the first part, you're kind of getting educated and preparing to be your career. In the second part, you're kind of really taking off your career. You're really figuring out what you're going to do, and you're really mastering it. And the third, you're kind of getting the benefits of what you've done in the middle part of your life, and either rewards or financial rewards or other psychic awards. So many people who are leaders in the first phase don't become leaders in the second and third phase. So you've all seen high school student body presidents, Rhodes Scholars, White House Fellows, Supreme Court clerks, All-American athletes. Now, since I was none of those, I said to myself, well, okay, my life isn't going so well because I didn't get to be great as all these people. It turns out that a lot of these people burn out. And the trick in life, I tell students, is to win the second and third part of life. I tell all White House Fellows and Supreme Court clerks and All-American athletes when I address these kind of people, it's great, but don't coast on this the rest of your life, because otherwise the people who are nothing in the first phase, they're going to pass you by. And that often happens. And so I try to encourage people to worry about the second and third part of life and what it is that makes people leaders. But I say of all the interviews I've done, I enjoy all of them. They're very rarely does somebody not do a good job in terms of interviewing. And I try to use humor to kind of spice it up a bit sometimes. But I thought Oprah was good, and as I said to her, I thought she had a really good future in TV if she wanted it. And whenever you interview a president of the United States, that's always fun. You know, so I interviewed Bill Clinton and George Bush together. That was quite interesting. So I don't know that there's anyone that I would cite, but I have thought about doing something new. I recently interviewed at Mount Vernon George Washington. There's a man who plays George Washington, and he knows it very well. And I was with him just the other night at Mount Vernon, and I've thought about getting people who know these characters so well. They dress up like them, or they can be them, and actually going back and doing interviews of William Shakespeare, Julius Caesar, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, by a person who knows them so well, they would give the answer that person would give, and seeing whether there'd be any interest in reading an interview about William Shakespeare and ask him, did he really write these plays, and see what answer he would give. We'll see.
It strikes me that if there's a shared trait among those who, some of whom you've mentioned, the people that you discussed in your interviews, perhaps that shared trait is having the courage of their convictions. Do you agree with that? And perhaps you could talk about, in closing, your overarching takeaways from the conversations you've had.
Were you talking about the courage of the convictions of the people that are writing about?
People of history, yes.
Yeah. Well, look, today there are 7.5 billion people on the face of the earth. And since humans came out of caves 400,000 years ago, maybe there have been 10 or 11 or 12 billion people on the face of the earth. All 12 billion, in some respects, are probably leaders in one little area. They're leaders of their family. They might be leaders of some little area. But most people don't get to be leaders of a country or global organization. So what makes those people get to the top? And I think in the end, what really makes people get to the top and really become really important leaders is they have a passion for their beliefs in something. They're willing to persist when people tell them they can't succeed. They're willing to take some personal sacrifices at time to get to the point that they want to get. And in some cases, they ultimately get where they want to go, and they actually achieve some things that make humanity better than it would otherwise be. But there are many people who just say, look, I don't want to do that with my life. I want to take a different type of path, but there's nothing wrong with that. But the people who are the most significant leaders in our world's history, our country's history today, are people that generally failed at something, they persisted at something, they overcame great odds, they did it at some personal sacrifice, and in some cases they enjoyed being the leader at the top, and sometimes when they got to the top and they did some great things, they were not happy people. I don't know whether Abraham Lincoln was a happy person. He had a complicated life. Maybe the greatest American in many ways, but was he happy? I'm not sure. Many times people who are successful, and when you spend time with them privately, they tell you all their troubles and why they're not happy. And so sometimes the happiest people are the people that are not the most famous. And Thomas Jefferson, if he wrote that life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness was the goal of our country, he never actually defined in the remaining 50 years what happiness was all about. and maybe because it's impossible to define it. But happiness generally is a rare thing, as all you know. If you're happy, you're very fortunate. Many people are not happy, and there's no secret to being happy. Being a leader doesn't necessarily make you happy, but it can help in some respects. But I think people should pursue what makes them happy without hurting other people, and then that's probably the ultimate goal of humanity, is to make themselves happy without hurting other people. And happiness generally comes by helping other people. That's where the greatest goals of history, the greatest goals of humanity is. You're helping other people. Nobody ever says, I just was at a soup kitchen feeding homeless people and I hate myself for doing that. Or nobody ever says, I gave scholarships to poor kids and now I hate myself for doing that. And just a final comment, just think about this. In 1888, there was a man sitting down at his breakfast table in Stockholm, and he was reading the newspaper, and he read the obituaries, and one of the obituaries he read was his own. It was Alfred Nobel, and he read that he died, and it said, the merchant of death is gone, the man who invented dynamite is no longer with us, thank God this terrible person's gone. What turned out, it was fake news that his brother had died, Ludwig, and the newspaper got it wrong. But he had the advantage or disadvantage of reading his own obituary. And he didn't like it, so he came up with the Nobel Prizes. And I tell people all the time, and you suggested the obituary, talked about that earlier, would you be pleased if tomorrow each of you could read your obituary and you knew what's going to be in there? And if you knew what was going to be in there, and if you could write it, if you weren't happy, what would you do to change it and make it better? And I ask people all the time to think about what they would do to make their obituary a little bit better. And actually, people do write their own obituaries a bit, because what happens, I was interviewed recently by one of the guys who writes obituaries for the New York Times, not about my own obituary, but he was saying that lots of people spend a lot of time lobbying to get their obituary written a certain way, as if, I guess, they want to make sure that it's going to be good when they're gone. And there are a lot of people that specialize in it. And I thought maybe there's a good business of providing obituary writing services for people who want their obituary to look better than it is. But the best way to do that is probably do a better job of living, and then maybe your obituary will be better.
And as a journalist, it begs the question, are you happy?
Well, when you're Jewish, it's very hard to be happy. So for somebody who's Jewish, yeah, and the main reason I'm probably happy is because my parents, who put I'm their only child, they put everything into me. They were not college or high school educated, and so they lived to see my, quote, success, and therefore that made me pretty happy. And so, yeah, I'm glad that they lived to see it, so that made me pretty happy, and that was probably a great excitement for me. But yeah, for somebody who's Jewish and has all the neuroses of people like me, I'm reasonably happy, yes.
David, as we wrap up and as a token of our appreciation, I'd like to present you with our official National Press Club coffee mug. It goes well with a good book, including one entitled The American Story, Conversations with Master Historians, a remarkable read. David Rubenstein, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for your contributions to the American story.
Thank you. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.